The first time Alina heard the violin cry, she was 7 years old. Standing in the doorway of her grandfather's workshop, while autumn rain hammered against the windows. The sound wasn't music, not yet. It was something rawer than that, something that seemed to come from deep inside the wood itself, as if the instrument were learning to breathe. Her grandfather's hands moved across the unfinished body with a patience that seemed to slow time itself. And in that moment, Alina understood that some things in this world were worth waiting for. Before we continue, if you'd like to join me for more stories like this, feel free to subscribe. I share a new one every day. And, if you don't mind, leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from, and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how far these stories travel. 20 years later, Alina would remember that afternoon as the last time she believed in the permanence of beautiful things. The workshop is gone now, sold to pay for medical bills that came too late to matter. Her grandfather's tools have been scattered to strangers who will never know the hands that shaped them. And the violin, the one he'd been making for her that rainy afternoon, the one he'd promised would sing like no other, sits in its case beneath her bed with a crack running through its face like a scar across a loved one's cheek. The apartment in Prague's old town is small, a converted attic space where the ceiling slopes so severely that Alina can only stand fully upright in the center of the room. But the rent is manageable, barely, and the single window offers a view of terracotta rooftops that glow amber in the evening light. On clear days, she can see the spires of St. Vita's Cathedral rising above the castle district, their Gothic peaks piercing the sky like frozen prayers. She works at a cafe on Delaware Street, the kind of place that caters to tourists seeking authentic Czech experience while serving Italian espresso and French pastries. The pay is modest, the hours long, and the work leaves her smelling of coffee grounds and burned milk. But it's honest work, and it allows her to remain invisible, which is what she's wanted ever since the accident. The accident. That's what everyone calls it, as if naming it something benign might soften its edges, might make it easier to carry. But Alina knows better. There are no accidents, only moments when the world reveals its capacity for sudden, irreversible change. One moment, she'd been walking home from the conservatory after a late practice session, her violin case swinging at her side. The next, a car had jumped the curb, its driver slumped over the wheel, and Alina had been thrown against the stone wall with enough force to shatter not just her instrument, but 3 bones in her left hand. The doctors had been cautiously optimistic. The bones would heal, they assured her, with physical therapy in time. She might regain most of her mobility, might. That single word had hung in the hospital room like smoke, impossible to grasp, impossible to ignore. And they'd been right, technically. The bones did heal. The scars faded from angry purple to pale white. But her 4th finger, the one that had been crushed most severely, would no longer straighten fully. It curved inward now, a permanent reminder that some things, once broken, never quite returned to their original shape. The conservatory had been understanding, even kind. They'd offered her time, told her the scholarship would wait, suggested she consider a path in music theory or composition. But Alina had heard what they weren't saying, the truth that lived in the spaces between their careful words. She would never play professionally, not with that hand, not the repertoire she'd spent her entire life preparing for. The dreams she'd carried since childhood, polished bright through years of 8-hour practice sessions and sacrificed summers, had ended in a single moment of bad luck and bad timing. So she'd left, not dramatically, not with tears or accusations. She'd simply stopped going, stopped answering calls, stopped pretending that anything could be salvaged from the wreckage. She'd packed her few belongings, found this attic apartment, and taken the job at the cafe. And every day, she walks past street musicians playing for coins, past concert posters advertising performances she'll never give, past music shops whose windows display instruments she'll never hold again. The broken violin stays in its case beneath her bed because she cannot bear to look at it, but she cannot bear to part with it either. It's the last thing her grandfather made, worked on during the final months of his life, when his own hands had begun to shake and fail. He'd died before finishing it, and Alina had been the one to complete the work. Following his notes and sketches, trying to honor his vision, even as she'd known she'd lacked his mastery. The instrument had never been perfect, would never match the legendary pieces that emerged from workshops in Cremona or Mittenwald, but it had been hers, made with love, and when she'd played it, she'd felt connected to something larger than herself, to a lineage of craftsmen and musicians stretching back through centuries. Now it's just broken, like her hand. like her future. Evening settles over Prague with the weight of velvet curtains falling across a stage. Alina climbs the 4 flights of stairs to her apartment, her legs aching from a double shift at the cafe. The building is old, its walls thick enough to muffle most sounds, but thin enough that she can hear the elderly couple in the apartment below arguing in rapid check, their voices rising and falling in a rhythm as familiar as breathing. She unlocks her door, steps into the gathering darkness of her room, and doesn't bother turning on the light. Instead, she moves to the window, pressing her forehead against the cool glass, watching the city transform. Street lamps flicker to life one by one, creating pools of yellow light along the cobblestone streets. In the square below, a group of musicians has set up, their instruments catching the lamplight as they begin to play something classical, something Alina recognizes but cannot name. The music drifts up through the evening air, and without meaning to, Alina's damaged hand begins to move, fingers twitching in muscle memory, trying to form positions for notes she'll never play again. She catches herself, forces her hand to still, and turns away from the window. That's when she sees him. A man stands on the rooftop across from her window, perhaps 20 meters away. He's positioned near the edge, his silhouette dark against the deepening blue of the sky. He's not looking at her, not threatening or intrusive. He's simply standing there, motionless, staring out at the city spread below. There's something in his posture, a quality of stillness so complete it seems to radiate outward, that makes Alina pause. She should close the curtains, she knows, turn away, respect the privacy of a stranger in his moment of solitude, but something holds her in place. Perhaps it's the way he stands, balanced on the precipice between the rooftop and the empty air beyond. Perhaps it's recognition, the sense that she is looking at someone who understands what it means to stand at the edge of something and wonder about the drop. The man doesn't move. Neither does Alina. They remain there, 2 strangers suspended in separate docks, until finally, without any particular decision being made, Alina pulls the curtains closed and turns away. She doesn't eat dinner. Instead, she lies on her narrow bed, staring at the water-stained ceiling, listening to the city sounds filtering through the walls. Somewhere, a baby cries. Somewhere else, laughter erupts and fades. The musicians in the square continue their performance, the notes climbing through the night like moths drawn to distant flames. Sleep, when it comes, is shallow and broken, filled with dreams of falling and flying that blur together until she cannot tell which is which. Morning arrives pale and uncertain, the kind of October dawn that can't quite commit to full daylight. Alina rises, makes instant coffee that tastes like burnt cardboard, and prepares for another shift at the cafe. She's learned to move through her morning routine with mechanical efficiency, thoughts carefully blank, attention focused only on the immediate task at hand. Shower, dress, coffee, keys, wallet. The rhythm of it is soothing in its predictability. But as she's leaving, she pauses at her window, and almost against her will, looks across to the neighboring rooftop. The man is there again. Or perhaps he's still there, never having left. He's in the same position as last night, or near enough that Alina cannot tell the difference. Same posture, same stillness, same quality of apartness that had caught her attention before. In daylight, she can see more details. He's older than she first thought, perhaps in his 50s, with grey hair and a dark coat that hangs loose on a frame that suggests recent weight loss. His face is turned away, angled toward the cathedral in the distance. Alina watches for perhaps 30 seconds, then forces herself to turn away and leave for work. It's none of her business. Prague is full of lonely people, full of those who seek solitude on rooftops and in empty churches, who walk the streets at odd hours trying to outpace thoughts that follow like shadows. She has no right to project her own brokenness onto a stranger. The cafe is busy, unusually so for a weekday morning. A tour group has arrived, their guide speaking rapid German while pointing at items on the menu. Alina moves through her tasks with practiced efficiency, making drinks, clearing tables, offering smiles that don't quite reach her eyes. The work is mindless, which is both its curse and its blessing. It keeps her hands busy, keeps her mind occupied with immediate concerns, but it also leaves too much space for memory to seep in around the edges. During her break, she steps into the narrow alley behind the cafe and pulls out her phone. She hasn't checked it in days, has been letting messages and notifications pile up unread. Now, for reasons she doesn't examine too closely, she opens her browser and types in a search, her damaged finger awkward on the screen. She searches for information about rooftop access. about whether it's legal to be on the building tops in Old Town. The results are unhelpful. A mix of tourist advice about panoramic views and stern warnings about private property. She tries a different search, typing words that feel dangerous even as she enters them. Suicide prevention, Prague. The results make her stomach tighten. Hotline numbers, statistics about mental health, articles discussing warning signs and intervention strategies. Alina skims through them, then closes the browser quickly, as if the act of searching might somehow make the concern more real. It's not her business. It's not her problem. She has enough to carry without taking on the weight of a stranger's potential despair. But that evening, when she returns to her apartment, she doesn't close the curtains immediately. Instead, she stands at her window, coffee mug warming her hands, and watches the rooftop across the way. The man is there, still there, always there. And this time, Alina doesn't turn away. She stands at her window, and she watches, and she wonders what it would take to call out to bridge the distance between two people who have perhaps forgotten how to ask for help. The watching becomes a routine, though Alina doesn't acknowledge it as such. Each morning, she checks the rooftop before leaving for work. Each evening, she stands at her window and confirms his presence. He never seems to sleep, or perhaps he sleeps somewhere else and returns to the rooftop at specific times. She cannot tell. His vigil appears as constant as her own. 3 days pass this way. 3 days of stolen glances and guilty observation. Alina tells herself she's being responsible, that she's simply keeping an eye on someone who might be in crisis. But she knows, in the honest part of herself she usually tries to ignore, that there's more to it than that. Watching him gives her something to focus on besides her own stalled life, her own stopped future. His pain, if pain it is, feels cleaner somehow, more defined. Her own is too diffuse, too tangled up in loss and regret, and the slow grinding awareness that she has given up without ever quite deciding to. On the fourth evening, something changes. Alina is at her window, as has become her habit, when the man finally moves. He turns from his vigil over the city and looks directly at her apartment. For a moment, they regard each other across the distance, two figures framed by windows and evening light. Then the man raises one hand, not waving exactly, but acknowledging. He's seen her. He knows he's been watched. Elena's first instinct is to retreat, to pull the curtains and hide from the embarrassment of being caught. But something stops her. Instead, she raises her own hand in response, a mirror gesture that feels both foolish and necessary. The man holds her gaze for another moment, then turns back to his contemplation of the city. But something has shifted. The silence between them feels different now. Less like two separate solitudes, and more like a shared space, a conversation being conducted in the language of presence and attention. That night, Alina does something she hasn't done in months. She pulls the violin case out from under her bed. The case is battered, covered in stickers from music festivals and competitions she attended years ago. Her name is written on the side in fading marker, along with her grandfather's address in the small town outside Prague, where he'd kept his workshop. She runs her fingers over the worn leather handle, feeling the grooves worn by years of carrying. She opens the case slowly, almost reverently. The violin lies in its fitted compartment, the crack visible even in the dim light of her apartment. It runs from near the bridge down through the lower bout, a jagged line that interrupts the smooth curve of the wood. Her grandfather had been experimenting with a new varnish recipe, something that was supposed to enhance the acoustic properties. Alina had applied it after his death, following his notes exactly. She'd done everything right, or tried to, but the varnish had never fully cured, remaining slightly tacky, and when the violin had struck the pavement during the accident, it had cracked along the grain in a way that suggested the wood had been compromised from the start. She doesn't take the instrument out. She simply looks at it, this broken thing that represents so many broken things. Her grandfather's last project, her own lost future. The connection to music that had been severed so suddenly and completely. She closes the case and slides it back under the bed. But something has shifted in her, some small crack in the wall she's built around the past. The next morning, Alina wakes early and does something impulsive. Instead of preparing for work, she pulls on warm clothes and leaves her apartment, climbing the stairs that lead to the building's roof access. The door is locked, as she knew it would be, but the lock is old and the frame loose. A few minutes of careful work with a bent hairpin, a skill learned from a misspent adolescence, and the door swings open. The rooftop is smaller than it appeared from below, and more cluttered. Chimneys rise like stone mushrooms, and ventilation pipes create an obstacle course near the edges. Alina moves carefully, aware of the drop on all sides, until she reaches the western edge of the building. From here, she can see across to the neighboring rooftop, where the man keeps his vigil. He's there now, in his usual spot, though from this angle she can see more of his face. He looks tired, deeply so, the kind of exhaustion that comes from carrying impossible weight for too long. But there's also something else in his expression, something almost peaceful, as if he's found in this high perch, a kind of sanctuary. Alina doesn't call out to him. Instead, she sits down near the edge, her legs dangling over the side, and simply shares the space. The morning air is cold, sharp enough to make her eyes water. Below, the city is beginning to wake, shops opening, people emerging for morning errands. The cathedral bells begin to toll, marking the hour with deep bronze notes that seem to vibrate through the very stones of the city. She sits there for perhaps an hour, maybe longer. The man across the way doesn't acknowledge her presence with any obvious gesture, but she senses he's aware of her, that her vigil mirrors his own. And in that shared silence, something unspoken passes between them. Not comfort exactly, but recognition, an understanding that sometimes the only response to pain is to witness it, to sit with it, to refuse to look away. Eventually, Alina rises and makes her way back down to her apartment. She's late for work now, will have to text an excuse, might even lose the shift, but she finds she doesn't care as much as she should. Something has loosened in her chest, some knot she hadn't fully realized was there. Over the following days, a routine develops. Alina visits the rooftop each morning before work, and the man is always there, always in his spot. They never speak, never even explicitly acknowledge each other beyond that first evening gesture. But the parallel nature of their vigils creates a kind of companionship, a shared solitude that feels less lonely than true isolation. Alina begins to notice things she'd stopped seeing. The way light moves across the rooftops as morning progresses, the patterns of birds that wheel and dive between buildings, the subtle shifts in the city's soundscape as 1 hour flows into another. The beauty hasn't gone anywhere. She'd simply stopped looking for it. One morning, perhaps 2 weeks into this new routine, Alina brings her violin case with her to the rooftop. She doesn't open it, not at first. She simply sets it beside her as she takes her usual position near the edge. The man across the way notices. She's certain, though he gives no sign. The case sits there, a third presence in their wordless communion. Alina stares at it, this object that holds so much weight, so much lost possibility. And slowly, so slowly, she's barely aware of the decision being made. She reaches for the clasps. The violin emerges from its case like something awakening from hibernation. Even with the crack, it's beautiful, the wood glowing in the morning light, the scroll carved with the delicate precision that had been her grandfather's signature. Alina holds it carefully, supporting it in a way that keeps pressure off the damaged area. She doesn't have her bow, didn't bring it, which means she cannot play in the traditional sense. But she can pluck the strings, test their voice, see what remains of the instrument's sound. She tunes carefully, her damaged hand clumsy but functional enough for this task. Then, quietly, she plucks out a simple melody, something her grandfather used to hum while working. The sound is wrong. The crack affects the resonance, creates overtones that shouldn't be there, gives the voice a quality that's almost plaintive, as if the violin is asking a question it cannot quite articulate. But it's still music. Broken music, perhaps, but music nonetheless. Alina plays for perhaps 5 minutes, simple melodies that require no particular virtuosity, just the basic language of note following note. And when she stops, when she lowers the instrument and looks across to the neighboring rooftop, she finds the man watching her directly, his attention fully focused in a way it hasn't been before. They regard each other across the distance. Then the man does something unexpected. He pulls a small notebook from his coat pocket and writes something. He holds it up, the writing too small for Alina to read at this distance. She shakes her head, gestures that she cannot make out the words. The man nods, understanding. He tears the page from the notebook and, after a moment's consideration, folds it into a paper airplane. It's such a childish gesture, so unexpected, that Alina almost laughs. The man launches the plane, and it catches a gust of wind, sailing across the gap between buildings in a graceful arc. It doesn't quite make it to Alina's rooftop, falling instead into the narrow alley below. But the gesture itself feels significant, an attempt to bridge the distance that has separated them. Alina waves in acknowledgement, and the man raises his hand in return. Then, before she can second-guess the impulse, Elena writes her own note in the small notebook she's taken to carrying for work orders. The violin is broken, she writes, like many things, but it still makes sound. She folds her note into a plane and launches it. The wind catches it differently, carrying it up and over, depositing it nearly at the man's feet. He retrieves it, reads it, and when he looks back at Alina, there's something new in his expression. The ghost of a smile, perhaps, or simply a softening around the eyes. He writes another note and sends it across. This one lands on Elena's rooftop, close enough that she can retrieve it without much trouble. She unfolds it carefully, her damaged finger making the task awkward but manageable. The note reads, "I am Dr. Novak. I taught music theory at the conservatory. Before. That single word carries so much weight. Alina understands immediately. Before whatever happened that brought him to this rooftop. Before loss or grief or failure knocked the ground out from beneath his feet. Before he too learned that life can crack open as suddenly and irrevocably as a violin falling on hard pavement." She writes back, "I was a student there. Before." More notes follow, crossing the space between buildings like migrating birds. In this way, through paper airplanes and stilted sentences, they begin to build a conversation. Dr. Novak, she learns, had taught at the conservatory for 30 years. He'd written extensively on Czech composers, had published papers that Alina vaguely remembers being mentioned in her classes. His wife had died 14 months ago, cancer that came suddenly and moved quickly. He'd tried to continue teaching, tried to maintain the routines that had structured his life, but found he couldn't. The music he'd spent his life studying had become unbearable. Every note, a reminder of what he'd lost. He'd taken a leave of absence that stretched into retirement, and he'd begun coming to this rooftop, this high place above the city, because here he could be alone with his grief, without burdening others with its weight. Alina writes about her own before, though more sparingly, more carefully. She mentions the accident, the broken hand, the broken instrument. She doesn't go into details about her grandfather, not yet. Some things feel too precious, too personal to commit to paper and cast across the sky. But she writes, "I stopped playing. I thought if I couldn't play perfectly, I shouldn't play at all." Dr. Novak's response comes quickly. Perfection is a tyranny we create for ourselves. Music exists to be made, not to be perfect. It's such a simple statement, the kind of thing she'd heard countless times from teachers and mentors. But reading it now, in this strange context, written in an elderly man's careful handwriting on a scrap of notebook paper, it hits differently. Alina feels something crack inside her, not breaking but opening, like the first fissure in ice at winter's end. The morning progresses. The city fully wakes below them, and Alina and Dr. Novak continued their conversation through paper airplanes, building a connection that feels both fragile and necessary. Eventually, Alina must leave for work. She writes a final note. Tomorrow. Dr. Novak's response. Tomorrow. That day at the cafe passes in a blur. Alina goes through the motions, making drinks and clearing tables, but her mind is elsewhere. She's thinking about Dr. Novak, about the conservatory, about all the things she's been avoiding. During her break, she makes a decision that surprises her even as she's making it. She calls the conservatory. The phone rings 4 times before someone answers, a secretary with a pleasant voice who asks how she can help. Elena's voice is unsteady as she asks about visiting hours, about whether it's possible to tour the facilities. The secretary is friendly, helpful, says the conservatory welcomes prospective students and their families to visit. Elena doesn't correct the assumption that she's a prospective student. She simply takes down the information and ends the call, her heart beating faster than the simple act of a phone conversation should warrant. That evening, she doesn't go directly to her apartment. Instead, she walks through the old town, past the astronomical clock, where tourists gather to watch the hourly procession of mechanical apostles. She crosses the Charles Bridge, weaving between artists selling portraits and musicians playing for coins. The Vltava River flows beneath, its surface catching the last light of day and throwing it back in rippling patterns. She finds herself at the Mala Strana side of the bridge, looking up at the castle complex rising above the city like a stone crown. Somewhere up there, beyond the tourists and the guards, are the archives where her grandfather had once researched violin-making techniques, poring over manuscripts describing methods used by medieval craftsmen. He'd brought her there once, when she was 12, and shown her documents that were hundreds of years old, their pages crackling with age. The knowledge doesn't die, he'd told her. As long as someone remembers, as long as someone cares enough to preserve it, the knowledge continues. Alina hadn't thought about that visit in years. The memory surfaces now with unexpected clarity, and with it comes a question she hasn't allowed herself to ask. What knowledge is she allowing to die by refusing to play? She doesn't have an answer. Not yet. But the question itself feels important, feels like the beginning of something. When she returns to her apartment, she pulls out the violin case again. This time, she takes the instrument fully out, examining it in the lamplight. The crack is still there, still obvious, still limiting. But Dr. Novak's words echo in her mind. Music exists to be made, not to be perfect. She picks up the bow, tightens the hair, applies rosin with careful strokes. Her damaged hand protests as she forms the bow grip, the curved finger making the position uncomfortable. But it's possible. Awkward, imperfect, but possible. Alina lifts the violin to her shoulder, settles her chin against the rest, and draws the bow across the strings. The sound that emerges is not beautiful. It's scratchy and uncertain. The bow pressure uneven, the intonation imprecise. The crack in the violin adds its own voice, a sympathetic vibration that distorts the fundamental tone. But it's music. Real, actual music, not just plucked notes, but the full voice of the instrument, damaged though it may be. Alina plays scales, simple exercises she learned as a child. Her hand tires quickly, the muscles unused to the position, the damaged finger unable to maintain proper pressure. But she pushes through, working her way up and down the fingerboard, relearning the geography of sound. After perhaps 20 minutes, she has to stop, her hand cramping too badly to continue. But she doesn't put the violin away. Instead, she sits with it in her lap, running her fingers along its curves, tracing the crack that mars its surface. She thinks about kintsugi, the Japanese art of repairing broken pottery with gold, making the damage part of the object's beauty rather than something to hide. The crack in her violin cannot be filled with gold, cannot be made beautiful in that way. But perhaps it doesn't need to be hidden either. Perhaps it can simply be acknowledged, accepted as part of the instrument's story. The next morning, Alina brings the violin to the rooftop. This time, she has her bow. And this time, when Dr. Novak appears on his neighboring perch, she doesn't just pluck strings, she plays its DVOK, a simple melody from the humoresque, something that doesn't require extensive technique or perfect intonation. Her playing is halting, uncertain, full of the kind of mistakes that would have horrified her former teachers, but she plays it through to the end. This broken piece of music on her broken instrument, and when she finishes, she looks across to Dr. Novak. He's standing now, no longer sitting in his usual position, and on his face is an expression she cannot quite read. Pain, perhaps, or recognition, or something more complex than either. He writes something and sends it across, and Alina retrieves the note with her heart racing. It reads, "I haven't heard music in 14 months. I stopped listening because it hurt too much. But that, what you just played, that I could hear. Thank you." Alina's eyes blur with tears. She doesn't try to hide. She writes back, "I haven't played in months. I stopped because I thought broken things should be put away. But maybe broken things can still have purpose." Dr. Novak's response comes quickly. Perhaps broken things understand each other in ways whole things never can. They remain on their separate rooftops for another hour, Alina playing simple melodies, and Dr. Novak listening, until the morning grows too late, and both must attend to the mundane necessities of living. But something has fundamentally shifted. The parallel nature of their solitudes has transformed into something more intentional, more connected. Over the following weeks, a new routine develops. Alina practices on the rooftop each morning, working through scales and simple pieces, rebuilding strength and flexibility in her damaged hand. Dr. Novak listens, sometimes writing comments or suggestions on paper airplanes he sends across. "Your bow pressure is too heavy on the downstroke," one note reads. Another, "Try thinking of the phrase as a single breath, not separate notes." The suggestions are helpful, couched in the gentle language of a teacher who understands the fragility of a student, rebuilding confidence. And slowly, incrementally, Alina's playing improves. Not back to where it was, not to the level of technical perfection she'd achieved before the accident, but to something else, something that feels more honest somehow, more human. She begins to vary her repertoire, moving beyond simple exercises to actual pieces. She plays folk songs her grandfather taught her, traditional melodies from Moravia and Bohemia that don't require virtuosic technique but demand musicality and feeling. She plays selections from Jana Ek, whose music seems to understand the rough edges of life. She even attempts some of the pieces she'd been preparing for her interrupted conservatory career, though these remain well beyond her current capability. Dr. Novak, for his part, seems to be undergoing his own transformation. He begins to move around on his rooftop rather than remaining fixed in one spot. One morning, Elena sees him conducting, his arms moving in the familiar patterns of directing an unseen orchestra. Another day, he's writing in a larger notebook, working on something with fierce concentration. They continue their paper airplane correspondence, the notes growing longer and more personal. Dr. Novak writes about his wife, about the music they'd shared, about the concerts they'd attended together over 3 decades of marriage. Elena writes about her grandfather, about learning to make instruments in his workshop, about the way his hands had shaped wood with such precision and care. "I think I've been mourning the wrong thing," Elena writes one morning. "I thought I was mourning my ability to play, but I think I was really mourning the future I'd imagined, the one where everything was perfect and nothing hurt." Dr. Novak's response: "All grief is complicated. We mourn who we thought we'd be as much as what we've actually lost, but perhaps there are other futures worth imagining. Different ones, not worse." Elena visits the conservatory on a grey Thursday afternoon when the cafe is closed for renovation. She walks through the familiar halls with the strange double vision of returning somewhere that's both intimately known and utterly foreign. The practice rooms are occupied, and through the thick doors she can hear fragments of Brahms, Shostakovich, Mozart, the sounds mixing together into a kind of accidental orchestra. She doesn't go inside any of the rooms. Instead, she finds her way to the main concert hall, the one where she'd performed in countless recitals and competitions. It's empty now, the seats folded up, the stage bare. Elena sits in the back row, in the spot where she'd always imagined her grandfather sitting during her performances. Though he'd never actually been well enough to attend any of her conservatory concerts, the hall's acoustics are remarkable, designed to carry sound to every seat with perfect clarity. Elena sits in the silence, feeling the weight of all the performances this room has held. All the students who've stood on that stage with hearts hammering and fingers trembling, hoping that their hours of practice would crystallize into something transcendent. She'd wanted that so badly, that moment of transcendence. She'd built her entire identity around becoming someone worthy of standing on stages like this one. And when that future had been taken away, she'd felt like nothing remained, like the crack in her hand had somehow invalidated her entire existence. But sitting here now, she realizes something. The music she'd made on the rooftop these past weeks, the broken sounds emerging from her damaged violin, had been more honest than many of the technically perfect performances she'd given in this hall. Not better, necessarily, but more true to something essential, less concerned with perfection and more focused on simply expressing what needed to be expressed. Elena leaves the conservatory with a strange sense of peace. She doesn't know what happens next, doesn't have a plan or a new dream to replace the old one. But she has tomorrow's practice session on the rooftop, and Dr. Novak's patient listening, and the slow work of rebuilding something she'd thought was permanently lost. Winter arrives in earnest, bringing snow that transforms Prague into something from a fairy tale. The rooftops become treacherous, icy and slick, but Elena and Dr. Novak maintain their morning meetings, both of them careful and determined. Elena's hands grow numb from cold, making playing even more difficult, but she persists. There's something about pushing through the discomfort, about insisting that music matters even when conditions are hostile. That feels important. Dr. Novak begins sending more than just technical advice. He starts writing out exercises specifically designed for Elena's limitations, pieces that work around her damaged finger rather than requiring full flexibility. Some are his own compositions, simple but elegant, clearly written with understanding of both her capabilities and her struggles. Others are adapted from existing works, modified to be playable while maintaining their essential character. "You're becoming my teacher again," Elena writes to him, "even though we've never spoken." His response: "Teachers and students exchange roles constantly. You've taught me more than you know. You've reminded me that music isn't only for the young or the whole. It's for anyone who needs it." One morning in late December, Elena arrives on the rooftop to find that Dr. Novak isn't alone. There's a younger man with him, perhaps in his 30s, and between them on the rooftop lies a cello case. The younger man is clearly uncomfortable with the height, staying well back from the edges, but he's there, and that seems significant. Dr. Novak writes a note and sends it across. My son, David, he plays cello. I told him about you. Would you play something together? Elena's heart hammers. She hasn't played with another musician since before the accident. Hasn't experienced that unique conversation that happens when two instruments find their way toward harmony. It feels like too much, too soon. But looking at Dr. Novak, seeing the hope in his expression, the way he's reaching out past his own grief to create this moment, Elena finds she cannot refuse. She writes back, what should we play? The answer comes quickly. Bach, Fugue, in G minor, simple and complex at once. David, the cellist, begins, his playing confident and warm, even in the cold air. Elena listens for a few measures, finding her place in the familiar architecture of the fugue, then joins in. Her violin, with its crack and its compromised voice, blends with the cello in ways she hasn't anticipated. The broken quality of her tone adds something unexpected to the piece, a fragility that makes the moments of consonance more precious. They play through the fugue twice, stumbling in places, finding their way through others. It's imperfect, full of the rough edges that come from strangers learning to communicate in real time. But it's also beautiful, in the way that broken things can be beautiful when they're brought together with care and attention. When they finish, Elena looks across to find Dr. Novak weeping openly, his son's arm round his shoulders. It's the first time she's seen him display such raw emotion, and the sight of it breaks something open in her own chest. She'd thought she was helping him by sharing her music, by maintaining their rooftop vigil, but she realizes now that it's been mutual, that they've been saving each other in small ways, one morning at a time. More notes cross the gap between buildings. Dr. Novak writes, I'm ready to go back to the conservatory, to teaching, not the same as before, but something new. Elena writes, I don't know if I'm ready, but I'm less afraid than I was. His response, that's enough. Being less afraid is enough. David, the cellist, becomes a regular presence on the rooftop, and sometimes he brings others. A violist, a pianist who carries a keyboard up 6 flights of stairs, a clarinetist whose warm tone cuts through the winter air like honey. They play together, this strange ensemble of musicians performing for an audience of 2 on neighboring rooftops. The city spread below them like a sleeping giant. Elena finds herself improving faster than she'd thought possible. The regular practice helps, but more than that, playing with others pushes her in ways that solo work never could. She has to listen more carefully, anticipate more precisely, adapt more fluidly. Her damaged hand remains a limitation, but she learns to work within those limitations, to find pathways through the music that honor both her abilities and her constraints. One morning, after they've finished playing a particularly successful run through a Brahms sextet, David calls across the gap. Have you thought about returning to the conservatory? As a student, Elena hasn't. The idea seems impossible, a door that closed so firmly she hadn't imagined it could open again. She writes this to Dr. Novak, who responds, doors close, but buildings have many doors. Perhaps you're looking at the wrong one. She doesn't understand what he means until later that evening, when she finds an email in her inbox. It's from the conservatory, from Dr. Novak's official account, asking if she'd be interested in enrolling in a new program he is developing, a specialized track for musicians who VA experienced injury or disability, focusing on adaptation, arrangement, and finding new ways to make music within changed circumstances. I can't promise it will lead to a performance career, the email reads, but I can promise it will be meaningful, and I can promise you won't be alone. Elena reads the email 3 times, then sits at her window, looking across to the rooftop, where Dr. Novak stands in his usual spot. He sees her at the window and raises his hand. She raises hers in return. She doesn't respond to the email that night, or the next day, or the day after that. She sits with the possibility, turning it over in her mind like a stone she's found on a beach, examining it from every angle. It terrifies her, the thought of returning to that building with its memories and its expectations, but it also calls to something in her, some part that hasn't died despite her best efforts to bury it. A week before Christmas, Elena makes her decision. She responds to the email with a simple message, yes, I'd like to try. Dr. Novak's return email is brief. Spring semester begins in February. There's much to prepare, but first, would you and the others consider giving a performance? Nothing formal, just a gathering in the conservatory's small recital hall, a demonstration of what's possible. Elena agrees, and the rooftop ensemble, as they've come to call themselves, begins preparing in earnest. They select pieces carefully, choosing works that showcase their strengths while acknowledging their limitations. Alina arranges several folk songs for their unusual instrumentation, writing parts that navigate around her damaged finger while maintaining the essential character of the melodies. The work is challenging, sometimes frustrating, often joyful. Alina finds herself thinking about music in new ways, not as something to be perfectly executed, but as something to be shaped and reshaped according to need and circumstance. She begins to understand what her grandfather had meant about knowledge, continuing, about preservation and evolution being two parts of the same process. The night before the performance, Alina cannot sleep. She lies in bed, her violin case propped against the wall where she can see it, and thinks about all the paths that led to this moment. The accident that broke her hand and her instrument, the months of grief and avoidance, the chance observation of a stranger on a rooftop, the paper airplanes carrying words across empty air, the gradual rebuilding of something she'd thought was permanently lost. She thinks about her grandfather, about the workshop that no longer exists, about the careful precision of his hands as they shaped wood into instruments. He'd been a perfectionist in his craft, demanding the highest standards of himself and his work. But he'd also understood that perfection was a direction, not a destination, that the pursuit mattered more than the achievement. Make things that matter, he'd told her once, not things that impress. There's a difference. The small recital hall is packed when Alina and the others arrive, far more people than she'd expected. Students, faculty, people from the community who'd heard about the unusual concert and wanted to witness it. Dr. Novak is there, of course, along with his son David, and standing near the back, almost hidden in the crowd, is the elderly couple from the apartment below Elena's, the ones who argue in Czech through the thin walls. Elena's hands shake as she prepares to play. The stage lights are bright, warm, making her sweat despite the winter chill outside. Her damaged finger throbs with tension. The crack in her violin seems to glow in the light, impossibly visible, a flaw she cannot hide. But then David draws his bow across the cello strings, establishing the opening notes of their first piece, and something in Alina settles. This isn't about perfection. This isn't about proving she's recovered or demonstrating that she's overcome her limitations. This is simply about making music. Broken music, perhaps, but music that means something because it's honest, because it acknowledges both damage and beauty as parts of the same whole they play. The sound that fills the hall is unlike anything that's typically heard in conservatory performances. It's rough in places, uncertain in others, marked by the distinctive voice of Alina's cracked violin and the adaptations the VA made for her injured hand. But it's also deeply moving, carrying an emotional weight that technical perfection often lacks. Alina plays a solo piece, one of Dr. Novak's compositions, written specifically for her limitations. It's not virtuosic, doesn't demand the kind of technical facility that would impress other musicians, but it's beautiful in its simplicity, in the way it finds poetry within constraints. As she plays, Alina thinks about kintsugi again, about how the Japanese art makes broken things whole, not by hiding the damage but by acknowledging it, incorporating it into the object's new beauty. When the final note fades, the audience remains silent for a long moment. Then the applause begins, not the polite acknowledgement typically given at student recitals, but something warmer, more genuine. Alina looks out at the crowd and finds Dr. Novak standing, his hands raised above his head, his face wet with tears. Others stand as well, and the applause continues, washing over Alina in waves. After the performance, people crowd around wanting to talk, to share their own stories of injury and adaptation, to ask questions about the new program Dr. Novak is developing. Alina tries to respond to everyone, but she's overwhelmed, exhausted in the way that comes from exposing yourself completely. Finally, Dr. Novak rescues her, guiding her to a quiet corner of the hall. They stand there, face to face for the first time, after months of rooftop observation and paper airplane correspondence. Up close, Alina can see the lines grief has carved into his face, but also something else: resilience, determination, the stubborn refusal to let loss have the final word. "Thank you," Alina says, the first words she's spoken directly to him, "for listening, for teaching, for helping me find my way back." Dr. Novak shakes his head. "I think we helped each other. You reminded me that music isn't about avoiding pain. It's about transforming it into something bearable, something that can be shared." They stand together in comfortable silence, to people who've learned to communicate in the absence of words, who've built a friendship on paper, airplanes, and broken music. Around them, the hall gradually empties. people returning to their lives, carrying something of what they witnessed here tonight. Alina returns to her apartment late, exhausted but more at peace than she's been in months. She places her violin carefully in its case, running her fingers one last time over the crack that mars its face. The damage is still there. It will always be there. But it's no longer something to hide, no longer a source of shame. She goes to her window and looks across to the neighboring rooftop. Dr. Novak is there, standing in his usual spot, but something about his posture is different. Less isolated, less apart. He sees her at the window and waves. A full gesture now, not the tentative acknowledgement of before. Alina waves back, then does something impulsive. She opens her window despite the cold, and calls across. Tomorrow morning, Dr. Novak's voice carries back across the gap. Tomorrow morning, the city sleeps below them, its buildings and streets and hidden lives continuing their eternal dance. Somewhere, a baby cries. Somewhere else, lovers whisper in the dark. And on two separate rooftops high above Prague's old town, two people who've learned what it means to be broken stand in the winter night, connected by music and grief and the stubborn insistence that tomorrow is worth meeting. Alina sleeps that night with her window open, the cold air carrying the sounds of the city into her dreams. She dreams of her grandfather's workshop, of wood shavings curling under his plane, of varnish being applied with patient strokes. But in the dream, she's not watching. She's working beside him, her hands whole and strong, shaping an instrument that will never be perfect, but will be exactly what it needs to be. When she wakes, morning light is spilling across her floor, golden and new. She dresses quickly, picks up her violin case, and climbs the stairs to the rooftop. The air is cold but clear, the sky that particular shade of winter blue that seems to contain infinite depth. Dr. Novak is already there, waiting. And beside him, David has returned with his cello. And beside David, other figures emerge. More members of their strange rooftop ensemble, all of them gathering in the cold morning to make music together. Alina takes her position near the edge. The city spread below like a promise. She lifts her broken violin, settles it against her shoulder, and begins to play. The notes rise into the winter air, imperfect and beautiful, carrying across the rooftops and down into the streets, where people pause in their morning routines, wondering at the sound. This is not the future Alina imagined when she first picked up a violin as a child. This is not the career she prepared for, not the life she'd carefully constructed through years of discipline and sacrifice. But it's a future nonetheless, one built not on the foundation of perfection, but on the acceptance of brokenness, on the understanding that damage and beauty are not opposites, but partners in the endless work of making meaning from experience. The music continues. And in a city built on centuries of survival, of reinvention, of making beauty from the ruins of what came before, Alina plays on, her broken violin singing its cracked and honest song to the morning sky.